Daniel Defoe is particularly remembered as the author of Robinson Crusoe. But he was in fact a prolific writer and wrote numerous books. One of his notable achievements was A Tour Through the Whole Island of Great Britain, published in 3 volumes between 1724 and 1727. His tour through Yorkshire began at Bawtry. Defoe wrote that it stands upon the great post highway or road from London to Scotland, and this makes it full of very good inns and houses of entertainment. He pointed out that Bawtry had a deep water channel, the River Idle, leading to the Trent at Stockwith, and eventually to the Humber and the port at Hull. By this navigation, Defoe wrote, Bawtry becomes a centre of all the exportation of this part of the country, especially heavy goods, which they bring hither from all the adjacent counties, such as lead from the mines and smelting houses in Derbyshire, wrought iron and edged tools from the forges of Sheffield, and millstones and grindstones in very great quantities are brought down and shipped off here. Bawtry became prosperous because of its wharf, where heavy goods were brought for shipping to the docks at Hull. Today, the only reminder of the trade is Wharf Street. Daniel Defoe described the road to Doncaster as pleasant and never once for repair. He called Doncaster a noble, large, spacious town, exceedingly populous, and a great manufacturing town, principally for knitting. Also, as it stands upon the Great Northern Post Road, it is very full of great inns. Defoe pointed out that William Camden, who visited Doncaster, possibly in the 1580s, wrote that in 759 AD the town was struck by lightning, and it was completely destroyed and sunk in its ruins. Camden believed it had hardly recovered from the fire when he was there. About 40 years before Camden's visit, John Leyland visited Doncaster and wrote of the fair large parish church of St. George, standing in the very area where once the castle of the town had stood. But in 1540 there was little sign of the castle, only part of the moat and some foundations of the walls. Leyland thought it was likely that when the church was erected, much of the castle's stonework was used in the foundations. Leyland also wrote about a Carmelite friary being founded in 1350, standing in Hallgate. He called it a right goodly house of white friars in the middle of the town, now defaced. There was also a house of grey friars at the north end of Friars Bridge. He described it as a mean building, standing on an island formed by the rivers Don and Chetswold. When he visited Sheffield, Defoe described the streets as narrow and the houses dark and black from the continued smoke of the forges which are always at work. Here they make all kinds of cutlery ware, especially knives, razors, axes and nails. Much of the work was carried out in workers' homes, though by the time Defoe arrived, numerous factories had been established. Defoe was also interested in Sheffield's history. There was formerly a very fine castle here, he wrote. Cardinal Wolsey and Mary Queen of Scots had been held captive in the castle. During the Civil War, the castle was captured by the parliamentarians and subsequently destroyed. Sheffield's cathedral, formerly the parish church dedicated to St. Peter, has been modified over the years, notably with the addition of the lantern tower in the 1960s, seen here on the left, alterations to the nave in the 1790s, and in the 16th century, the Shrewsbury Chapel was built. John Talbot, a military commander, inherited the lordship of Sheffield following his marriage to Maud de Neville, Baroness Furnivall. He was created Earl of Shrewsbury in 1442. He was killed 11 years later in battle when a cannonball felled his horse. A monument at Castillon in France marks the site of the battle and was erected to his memory. Several of his descendants were buried in the vaults at Sheffield, though some bodies were missing when the crypt was discovered during construction work. Those buried there include George, the 4th Earl, who died in 1538, his grandson George, the 6th Earl, who was responsible for the custody of Mary Queen of Scots and who died in 1590, and his son Gilbert, the 7th Earl of Shrewsbury. Gilbert Talbot founded the Shrewsbury Hospital by his will of 1616, but his bequest was not carried out until 50 years later. That hospital originally stood beside the River Sheaf, near the town's centre, and was prone to flooding, causing the death of some patients. However, in 1823 a new site was chosen in Norfolk Road, and that hospital opened in 1827. It was built in the Gothic style and considered to be one of the finest houses in England. The hospital still stands in its garden, mostly hidden by trees and looking a little forlorn, as all entrances from Norfolk Road are locked. On the other side of the road is the entrance to Sheffield's Cholera Burial Ground, where in 1832 402 victims were buried. About 100 years later, the land and adjoining woodland were given to Sheffield Council by the 16th Duke of Norfolk, a descendant of John Talbot and the Earls of Shrewsbury. Daniel Defoe wrote about the seat of the Dukes of Norfolk, calling it a noble mansion house, but it is now all demolished and decayed. It had been dismantled on the orders of Thomas, Duke of Norfolk, in 1706, a few years before Defoe arrived. Due to the prosperity of Sheffield's trade, in the early 18th and 19th centuries, several important buildings were erected. Daniel Defoe may have seen the old Cutler's Hall in Church Street, which this one replaced in 1726. It was the second hall built on the site, and some years later it was replaced by a splendid new hall. This building is used for important events such as the annual Cutler's Feast. The first stone for the Grecian-style music hall was laid in 1823, and it later became the public library. That building was eventually demolished to make way for the new Central Library. The Church of St Mary's, a gift of the 12th Duke of Norfolk, opened in the 1820s. The town hall that Daniel Defoe would have seen was replaced by this newer building in the early 1800s, but within 70 years it had outgrown its usefulness, and the council erected a far more impressive building. As he rode towards Rotherham, Daniel Defoe noted the Roman fortifications at Templeborough. He wrote, "Very plain to be seen, I suppose may remain so to the end of time." Unfortunately, that was not to be the case. The site was needed to extend a steelworks to build more armaments during the First World War and had to be levelled. Now the site is occupied by the Magna Science and Adventure Centre. Defoe continued to Rotherham and wrote, I saw nothing of note except a fine stone bridge over the Don. He then headed northwest towards Tankersley and saw the park stocked with a herd of deer, believing that one of the hinds was larger than his horse. Tankersley Hall was a home of Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, who was found guilty of treason and beheaded in the reign of Charles I. His body was taken to Wentworth for burial. Tankersley Hall was abandoned and is now a ruin standing next to a farmhouse, while the main residence of the Wentworth family became Wentworth Hall. Riding over what he described as vast moors, Daniel Defoe said he entered the most populous part of this county, the West Riding. Passing Black Barnsley, he noted, "The very town looks black and smoky, as if all were smiths that lived in it," though he supposed the name came from the colour of the moors, not the black smoky town. Eventually he entered what he described as the first town of note, Wakefield, a large, handsome, rich clothing town, full of people and full of trade. He continued, "A clean, large, well-built town, very populous and very rich. Here is a very large church, and well filled it is, for here are very few dissenters. The steeple is a very fine spire, and by far the highest in all this part of the country, except that at Sheffield. They tell us there are here more people also than in the city of York, and yet it's no corporation town, and the highest magistrate, as I understand, was a constable. The Calder passes through this town under a stately stone bridge of 12 arches, upon which is a famous building, by some called a chapel, by others a castle. The former is the most likely. It was built by Edward IV in memory of the fatal Battle of Wakefield, wherein his father, Richard, Duke of York, was killed. The battle was one of a series fought during the War of the Roses and took place in December 1460, close to Sandal Castle. Previously, Richard of York had forced the Lancastrian king, Henry VI, to name him as heir to the English throne. In December, he was in residence at Sandal Castle when he heard the news that a band of his men had been ambushed near Wakefield, possibly by Lancastrian forces stationed at Pontefract. He decided to seek revenge. The two armies met at Wakefield Green opposite the castle. However, the superior forces of the Lancastrians forced Richard to retreat towards the castle, but he was killed before reaching safety. A monument now stands in Marygates Lane to mark the site of the fighting. The Chantry Chapel is now surrounded by the busy city and stands forlornly on the old bridge. When Defoe saw it, he wrote, "The chapel is now made use of for civil affairs, for we do not now pray for the souls of those slain in battle, and so the intent of that building ceases." William Bray travelled through Yorkshire in 1777 and wrote that the chapel had been converted into a warehouse and is now let to an old clothsman. However, since 1990 it has been cared for by the Friends of Wakefield Chantry Chapel and is a Grade 1 listed monument, so its preservation should be assured. Daniel Defoe was no stranger to Yorkshire or to the clothing trade. He lived in Halifax for a period and made a number of journeys into industrial areas. In the 1720s, he saw an area thriving with industry when riding from Blackstone Edge to Halifax. "The nearer we came to Halifax," he wrote, "we found the houses thicker and the villages greater in every bottom. And not only so, but the side of the hills, which were very steep every way, was spread with houses. Though we saw no people stirring without doors, yet they were all full within. Not a beggar, not an idle person to be seen, except here and there an almshouse, where the people, ancient and decrepit and past labour, might perhaps be found. The people here, however laborious, generally live to a great age, a certain testimony to the goodness and wholesomeness of the country, which is without doubt as healthy as any part of England." The reason for the empty streets became apparent when Defoe entered a house. "We presently saw a house full of lusty fellows, some at the dye-fat, some dressing the cloths, some in the loom, all hard at work, and all seeming to have sufficient business. Running water was supplied from a little rill or gutter. The little streams were so parted and guided by gutters or pipes, and by turning and diverting the streams, that none of those houses were without a river, if I may call it so, running into and through their workhouses. Halifax clothiers had their own punishment for those caught stealing cloth: execution by the guillotine. John Aston, a royalist who supported Charles I, described it in 1639 when it was still in use. "It is raised upon a little forced ascent of some 6 steps," he wrote, "and is made in the form of a narrow gallows. The block is drawn up by a pulley, and the malefactor lays his head on the block below. Then they let run the stock with the hatchet in and dispatch him immediately." About 100 years later, when Defoe saw the guillotine, it was no longer in use, but stories were still rife. He was told how the accused could make a last-minute escape. After his head had been laid down, and the signal given to pull out the pin, he could, if he be so nimble as to snatch out his head between the pulling out the pin and the falling down of the axe, and could get upon his feet, jump off the scaffold, run down a hill, and get through the river before the executioner could overtake him and seize upon him, he was to escape. His informers insisted that one man did remove his head in time, and ran down the hill calling the townspeople to give him his hat back. Halifax Minster dates to the 15th century, though there is evidence of an older church standing on the site. It was the first stone building in the town, since until then all buildings were made of wood. Even as late as 1830, many wooden buildings still lined the narrow streets. Halifax had an established market where a variety of goods were sold, including woolen goods and clothing. Fairs were held in June and November for the sale of horses, horned cattle, sheep, and pigs. Congregationalists held regular meetings in Halifax as early as 1763, and within 10 years had opened a chapel. When built, it was the largest nonconformist chapel in England. In recent years, it has been used as an arts centre. The Peace Hall was opened in 1779 and contained 315 rooms where clothiers could offer their wares. In recent years, it has gone through a complete refurbishment and is now a listed building. The assembly and concert rooms were built in 1828. 2 years later, it became the first home of the Halifax Literary and Philosophical Society and housed the subscription library together with the Society's museum. The building was demolished in 1894 to make way for the police and court buildings. When riding over the Pennines, Daniel Defoe would have seen pack horses loaded with bundles of cloth, making their way to the markets of Huddersfield, Wakefield, Halifax, or Leeds. He visited Leeds in 1724 and described it as a noble scene of industry. Many travellers and gentlemen have come over from Hamburg, nay, even from Leipzig or Saxony, on purpose to see it. Leeds is a large, wealthy and populous town. He was up early to visit the cloth market and see the trestles being placed in double rows in Briggate. Here planks were laid like long counters on either side, from one end of the street to the other. Clothiers arrived and went to the inns and public houses to drink a pot of ale or eat a trencher of boiled or roast meat, while waiting for the bell to ring to signal the opening of the market. It would surprise a stranger to see how within a few minutes, without hurry or noise, and not the least disorder, the whole market is filled. All the boards upon the trestles are covered with cloth, and the clothiers standing ready. The bell stopped ringing, and the buyers were allowed in to inspect the cloth. Many were dealers with contacts in all parts of the country. When dealers found cloth they wanted, they spoke in a whisper to the stall-holder, and in the fewest words imaginable, the price is stated, one asks, the other bids, and it is agreed or not agreed in a moment. It's all managed with the most profound silence. It's all done in a whisper. The clothiers stand so near to one another, and it's always reasonable that one should not know what the other said, for that would be discovering their business. In less than an hour, most of the deals had been done. At 8:30 the bell rang again. Immediately the buyers disappear, the cloth is all sold, or if here and there a piece happens not to be bought, it is carried back into the inn, and in a quarter of an hour there is not a piece of cloth to be seen. The first cloth hall in Leeds was built in Kirkgate. Apparently merchants in Wakefield had opened an indoor market in an attempt to entice traders away from Leeds, but Leeds traders retaliated by building their own cloth hall for the sale of undyed cloth, and plans are being carried out to reconstruct the building on the original site. By 1756, trade was still increasing, and the white cloth hall was replaced by a much larger building which stood south of the river. A few years later, when William Bray visited Leeds, he discovered that the cloth trade was still thriving, and a hall dedicated to the sale of coloured cloth had been opened. It was paid for by a subscription of nearly 1,600 clothiers, each of whom had a space allocated to him for the sale of cloth. The coloured cloth hall was pulled down in 1890, and part of the site became City Square. Traffic has subsequently been diverted and the square refurbished to become a pedestrian area. By 1786, the merchants dealing in white cloth had occupied larger premises to sell their undyed cloth. It served the traders for about 75 years, and part of it still stands near the Corn Exchange in Cloth Hall Street. The remainder had to be demolished in order for the North Eastern Railway Company to extend their tracks into the city. The railway company was obliged to pay for the construction of the fourth white cloth hall, built in King Street. It was, however, never fully used, and within 30 years it was closed and demolished. The site is now occupied by the Hotel Metropole, but as a reminder of the old halls, the cupola which had adorned previous buildings was placed on the hotel's roof. A church was recorded at Leeds when the Domesday Book was compiled. It was the forerunner of St. Peter's, the Saxon church burned down in the 14th century, and this print, dated 1815, shows the church that replaced it. It served as the parish church for many years, but in the mid-19th century it was replaced by the church that now stands on the site. In 2012 it was designated the Minster Church of Leeds. St John's is the oldest church building in Leeds city centre, being founded by the wealthy loyalist John Harrison. It was consecrated in 1634, and its benefactor is buried near the altar. The church has now become redundant, but has given its name to a large indoor shopping centre. Holy Trinity was built in 1727 and has a spire that was added later. In recent years it's become a community arts centre, hosting a range of concerts and exhibitions. St Paul's was consecrated in 1793. It was a huge building, catering for more than 1,000 worshippers. But in the early 20th century, when the population moved from the city centre into the suburbs, it was demolished. Leeds Mill Hill is a Unitarian chapel and was established in 1674 by prominent Leeds merchants and industrialists. The present chapel replaced the older building in the mid-19th century. Briggate and the former marketplace, now called the Arcades, are among the streets that were made into a pedestrian area, free of traffic, and are often very busy with shoppers. It is here that the Moot Hall once stood. It was originally built in about 1618, but Daniel Defoe would have seen the one depicted in this print, which replaced the older hall in 1710. It served as the seat of the city council and was used for judicial purposes. When Leeds went through a period of rapid growth in the mid-19th century, a new town hall was required. Plans were approved in January 1851 to erect what is one of the largest town halls in the country. Queen Victoria visited Leeds to perform the opening ceremony. The Moot Hall was pulled down to make way for a corn exchange, and the statue of Queen Anne from the old hall was used to adorn the new building. After only 30 years, the corn exchange was proving too small, and the architect Cuthbert Broderick was commissioned to plan a new building in the Calls area. It opened in 1863, and the old exchange was dismantled. However, the statue of Queen Anne was preserved and is now kept in the city's art gallery. By the 1960s, the exchange was no longer used for dealing in corn, though the building still operates as a centre for trade, housing a wide range of specialty shops, selling such things as jewellery, clothing, vinyl records and cameras, not the digital cameras we use today, but the ones that use film. The Red House was built in the early 17th century and is said to have been the first brick-built house in Leeds. It stood in Upper Hedgerow and was one of the most opulent houses in the city and fit for a king. In fact, it was used as a prison for King Charles I, 3 years before his execution. The building no longer exists. The library building dates to 1768, but the library moved to new premises in the early 1800s, and this building was used to publish the Leeds Intelligencer, one of the first regional newspapers in Britain. It later became the Thoresby Society Library and Archives. The first infirmary in Leeds was opened in 1771 and gave its name to Infirmary Street. It was staffed by physicians who were graduates of the Edinburgh University Medical School. Today, the site is marked by a blue plaque on the Yorkshire Penny Bank building. Leeds Courthouse, opened in 1803, stood almost opposite the infirmary. Another building nearby, the Grecian-styled Commercial Buildings, opened in 1826 and was complete with a newsroom, concert room, and other areas for refreshment and relaxation. The Central Market on Duncan Street opened in 1827. It contained a hotel, 67 shops, 56 stalls, 6 offices, and a fancy goods bazaar on its balcony. But the building was subsequently damaged by fire and eventually demolished. There was fierce opposition from the city of York at applications to make the Ayr and Calder Canal navigable as far as Leeds. The city fathers feared that trade on the Ouse would be lost, but despite their worries, royal assent was given in 1699. In November the following year, navigation was opened as far as Leeds Bridge, and shortly afterwards, the Ayr and Calder Navigation Company erected large warehouses at Leeds to hold cloth, woolen goods and corn for shipping to Hull. Daniel Defoe noted that river trade was flourishing as goods were being shipped as far as Holland, Hamburg and the Baltic. On their way back from Hull, the river boats carried great quantities of coal to Wakefield and Leeds. Sir George Head, who travelled through Yorkshire's industrial areas in the 1830s, saw Blenkinsop's steam engine working at Leeds Staithes, bringing coal from the pits in wagons holding 3.5 tons each, on an iron rail road of 2.5 miles long. He wrote, "Locomotive steam engines are curios worthy of observation." A year previously, a railway began operating from Leeds to Selby, which provided an alternative route to Hull, and Sir George decided he would make the journey. We were dragged by the locomotive engine through the tunnel at the rate of 12 miles an hour. 3 or 4 stoppages were made on the way to take up and set down short fares. Nevertheless, we performed the whole distance, 19 miles and 7 furlongs, in 1 hour and 4 minutes. Although the railway establishment at Selby is not so large as at Leeds, the buildings are commodious and well arranged, consisting of the booking office and immediately contiguous a spacious shed. Some trains were timed to connect with steamboats, but Sir George preferred to stay overnight at the George Inn. Next morning he was hustled out of the hotel to board the packet boat that left for Hull at 8, being timed to take passengers on the early morning train from Leeds. Navigating the Ouse and Humber was difficult, as shifting mud silted up the channels. Taking advantage of high tide was vital, but Sir George wrote that the proprietors of the packet boat start every morning unflinchingly at 8 o'clock, in spite of wind and tide, and in defiance of all rational objections. The tide was going out, but all went well until the boat came to a halt on a mudbank. Passengers were shepherded from side to side in an attempt to rock the boat free. After being stuck in the mud for 3 hours, Sir George inquired why this packet boat might not, by starting some time later, have allowed the people to pass their time at Selby instead of upon this mudbank. They finally arrived in Hull at 6 in the evening, having travelled at an average speed of 4 miles per hour. When Daniel Defoe visited Ripon, he called it a very neat, pleasant, well-built town, and has not only an agreeable situation on rising ground between 2 rivers, but the marketplace is the finest and most beautiful square that is to be seen of its kind in England. In the middle of it stands a curious column of stone, imitating the obelisks of the ancients, though not so high, with dials also upon it. The column was rebuilt some years after his visit. He also wrote about the large collegiate church, very handsome, ancient and venerable pile of building. Mr. Camden says this town of Ripon owes its greatness to religion. Ripon Cathedral has a long history and represents one of the earliest stone buildings erected in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria. Monks from Melrose Abbey in Scotland founded the first monastery at Ripon in about 660 AD, but their wooden structure was replaced by a stone church when it was refounded as a Benedictine monastery a few years later by Wilfrid. Wilfrid was born in about 633 AD to an aristocratic Northumbrian family. As a teenager, he entered a religious life and studied at Lindisfarne, Canterbury, Gaul and Rome. He was about 40 years old when he founded the cathedral and became its first abbot. When he died in 709, he was buried near the high altar and later venerated as a saint. William, a monk of Malmesbury and a 12th century historian, wrote of the wonderful arches, pavements and galleries of the medieval abbey, and that it was destroyed by Vikings during the reign of King Edred. A second minster was destroyed by William the Conqueror during the harrowing of the north, but Thomas of Bayeux, appointed Archbishop of York by William I, built the third church. The present building is the fourth on the site and dates to the 13th century. Amazingly, the Anglo-Saxon crypt has survived the cathedral's turbulent history. William Camden described Bedale as a fair market town, with a handsome church containing a monument of Brian Fitz-Alan. He was lord of the manor, who died in 1306. He was descended from the Dukes of Brittany and Earls of Richmond, and was brother-in-law to John Balliol, King of Scots. When Daniel Defoe arrived in Bedale, about 150 years after William Camden, it was developing as a centre for breeding racehorses, and he wrote, "The town was full of jockeys, dealers of horses and breeders of horses." But if he visited Bedale today, he would discover it is a busy market town with little sign of horses. To see horses, he would have to go further north, to Middleham. Defoe seemed to be an authority on horses when he wrote, "They do indeed breed very fine horses here, perhaps some of the best in the world. For let foreigners boast what they will of Barbs and Turkish horses, and as we know, £500 has been given for a horse bought in Turkey, and of the Spanish jennets from Cordova, for which also an extravagant price has been given. I do believe that some of the gallopers of this counties and of the bishopric of Durham, which joins to it, will outdo for speed and strength the swifter horse that was ever bred in Turkey or Barbary, taking them all together." After the Norman conquest, Richmond was granted to Alan Rufus of Brittany, and in order to control the area, a castle was built. It consisted of a keep and a wall that encompassed much of the town and included part of the marketplace. A lane from the marketplace leads to the only medieval town gate that has survived in Richmond. The castle was subsequently held by various Dukes of Brittany, but in 1453 it was conferred on Edmund Tudor and merged with the crown when his son Henry succeeded as Henry VII. When William Camden visited Richmond, he said the town was walled but the strong castle had been destroyed. Celia Fiennes, who visited Richmond on her second journey through Yorkshire, wrote about the approach to the town. "One cannot see till just upon it, being encompassed with great high hills," she wrote. "I descended a very steep hill to it, from whence we saw the whole town, which itself stands on a hill. Its buildings are all stone, the streets are like rocks themselves. There is a very large space for the markets, which are divided for the fish market, flesh market, and corn." She wrote about 2 good houses. One was Mr. Darcy's, brother of the Earl of Holderness, and the other belonged to Mr. York. Both were parliamentarians, and they had good walled gardens, though the rest of Richmond looks like a sad shattered town, and fallen much to decay, and like a disregarded place. A few years later, Daniel Defoe described Richmond as a large market town, and wrote of the woolen trade. "Here you see all the people, great and small, knitting. And at Richmond you have a market for woolen or yarn stockings, which they make very coarse and ordinary, and they are sold accordingly. For the smaller size stockings for children are here sold for 18 pence per dozen, or 3 halfpence a pair, sometimes less." About 60 years later, John Byng, a colonel who later succeeded as 5th Viscount Torrington, arrived in Richmond. His views were influenced by his military background when he wrote of exercises being carried out by the North York militia, composed of much good stuff, but what a pity to be thus uselessly abandoned to alehouses. Later he added, "A fine body of men, but ruined here, and rendered useless to their country in every way, both as soldiers and labourers." A permanent military presence was established in Richmond, with the completion of the barracks in 1877. The Green Howards Regimental Museum is now situated in Holy Trinity Church, and contains exhibits tracing the long history of the regiment, with displays of over 3,700 medals, including 16 Victoria Crosses. The obelisk in the market replaces the old medieval market cross towards the end of the 18th century. Also in the market is the town hall, built in 1756. On the south side is Millgate House, an 18th century dwelling with a superb garden arranged on terraces. The tower in Greyfriars Garden dates to the 14th century and served as a bell tower for the Friary Church. The Georgian Theatre Royal is thought to be the oldest working theatre still in its original form anywhere in Europe. It opened in 1788 due to the influence of Samuel Butler, but closed about 50 years later and was used as an auction house and warehouse. Following a complete restoration, it reopened as a theatre in 1968. Despite his scepticism, John Byng liked Richmond. He found butter was cheap at 5 pennies per pound, and a chicken cost only 10 pennies, while coal was very cheap. Houses were good and easy to rent, walks in the area were charming, and fly fishing on the wharf was excellent. Richmond becomes one of the best retiring towns in England, he concluded. The Battle of Marston Moor, one of the major battles fought during the English Civil War, took part on moorland on both sides of the road between Long Marston and Tockwith, and was one of the sites Daniel Defoe visited. He wrote, "'Twas none of our business to concern our passions in the cause, or regret the misfortunes of that day. The thing was over beyond our ken. Time had levelled the victors with the vanquished, and the royal family being restored, there was no room to say one thing or other to what passed." Both John Leyland and William Camden, who visited the battlefield at Towton in the 16th century, wrote of the burial mounds being still visible half a mile north of Saxton, and they also appear on the 18th century map. Daniel Defoe did not mention the graves, though he was moved when he wrote, "The most cruel and bloody battle was fought between the two houses of Lancaster and York in the reign of Edward IV. I call it most cruel and bloody because the animosity of the parties was so great that though they were countrymen and Englishmen, neighbours, nay, as history says, relations, for here fathers killed their sons and sons killed their fathers, yet for some time they fought with such obstinacy and such rancour that, void of all pity and compassion, they gave no quarter, and I call it the most bloody, because 'tis certain no such numbers were ever slain in one battle in England. For here at Towton fell 36,000 men on both sides." Unfortunately, 2 of the 3 houses Daniel Defoe visited when staying in York have been dismantled. Lounsborough Hall was originally built in 1598 by George Clifford, 3rd Earl of Cumberland. When the 5th and last Earl, Henry Clifford, died without a male heir, the property passed to his daughter Lady Elizabeth, and through her to her husband Richard Boyle, the 2nd Earl of Cork. Richard Boyle received the title 1st Earl of Burlington and decided to enlarge Lounsborough Hall and create the formal gardens. On the death of the 3rd Earl of Burlington without a male heir, Lounsborough passed through his daughter Charlotte to her husband William Cavendish, who later became the 4th Duke of Devonshire. The Devonshire family had numerous expensive houses to maintain and subsequently demolished Lounsborough Hall, replacing it with a Victorian house which still stands. Another house Defoe visited, Kiveton Hall near Sheffield, was built in about 1700 by Sir Thomas Osborne, 1st Duke of Leeds. Just over 100 years later, it was demolished by the 6th Duke, who then made Hornby Castle the family home. The house that Daniel Defoe visited, which is still standing, is Castle Howard, or Carlisle House as he called it. It was begun in 1699 by the 3rd Earl of Carlisle, as a mansion for the Carlisle branch of the Howard family. Defoe pointed out that it was not finished when he was there, and added, "It may not be perhaps in our time. They say his lordship sometimes observes noblemen should only design and begin great palaces, and leave posterity to finish them gradually, as their estates will allow them." Fortunately, Castle Howard was completed. As he rode towards Durham, Daniel Defoe briefly visited some of the coastal resorts. He described Spurn Head as a long promontory thrusting into the sea and making the north point of the Humber, and is a remarkable thing. He thought Bridlington, or Burlington, was a place of no note, only for a bay or road for shipping, which is of use to the colliers on this coast to defend them in case of extremity of weather. Scarborough next presents itself. He wrote, "A place formerly famous for the strong castle, situate on a rock, as it were hanging over the sea, but now demolished, being ruined in the last wars. The town itself is well built, populous and pleasant, and we found a great deal of good company here drinking the waters, who came not only from all the north of England, but even from Scotland." Finally, he pointed out that Whitby has an excellent harbour, and was where they built very good ships for the coal trade, and many of them too, which makes the town rich. Comparing the size of towns and cities in Yorkshire on the maps Daniel Defoe might have used with those of today, I'm sure he would be amazed at the changes that have taken place over the years. Modern maps show how the areas have grown in size and are still growing to cope with the increasing population. If they continue to expand at the same rate over the next 100 years or so, it's likely that cities such as Leeds, Bradford and Halifax will have merged into one huge metropolis.